So we're here in the Tavern room of Wright Tavern. So this is in the center of downtown Concord. The house was built 1747, and it is a tavern. So it's a public house. It's a place where people gather for food and drink, but it's also a place where committees would gather and have meetings and things like that, important business. It also works very much in tandem with the meeting house just a short distance away. And if you look at the Doolittle engraving of the British Army entering Concord on April 19th, 1775, you can see this structure very clearly still in the same place that it is today. Now, why is this tavern important in the story that we've been talking about in the lead up to the outbreak of war on April 19th, 1775? And this is where the Committee of Safety was meeting. So a little bit about them. Now, in October of 1774, after General Gage had disbanded the colonial legislature, they reconstituted themselves and formed a provincial congress. And they started to assume really the reins of government in the province of Massachusetts Bay. And they moved their operation out here to Concord in October, and the big Congress was meeting in the meeting house. But as we get into the latter part of the year and into early 1775, and these delegates, who again have assumed the reins of government in Massachusetts, they're even sending letters out to the towns requesting those towns that have yet to submit their property taxes or rates to the royal government to give them instead to Henry Gardner, who is the treasurer for the provincial congress. So they're establishing a cash flow. And what's amazing is that this government, which is, semi-legal, it's really on sort of shaky grounds legally, has such wide support of the people. So they actually are getting money coming in support of the people in towns all across Massachusetts. But now they're like, all right, we have money coming in, things are looking increasingly hostile, growing number of British soldiers in Boston, the harbor's still blockaded, and both sides, of course, are rushing to gather arms and ammunition, artillery. That was one of the big items that both sides were desperate to secure. So they formed what was called the Committee of Safety, and they are spearheading the military buildup. So stockpiling the arms, determining where they're getting them from, where they're being stored. Concord, of course, was one of the major magazines or supply depots, but there were many towns that were involved in the effort. And they're overseeing the reorganization of the militia, and really putting them on a warlike footing, getting ready for the coming conflict against the British Army, their own army, that would, of course, occur in April of 1775. And this is where they're meeting, here in Wright Tavern. So this is very much the place where all of these preparations are being made and all these plans are being made. Joel, now you've done a lot of research on the Committee of Safety. So what can you tell us about sort of the extent of their operation?
Well, it's great to be in this building where they made all these decisions. But the Committee of Safety had another subcommittee called the Committee of Supplies, and they were the ones who made the decisions on what they were going to purchase. And then they had Colonel James Barrett, Captain Jonas Haywood of Concord. They worked for the Committee of Supplies, and they were the ones in charge of carrying out all the orders, where things were going to be. There were supplies stockpiled all over town, including Barrett's house, which we're going to visit soon. And the decisions that were being made here were extremely important. They knew the British were coming at some point, and you can see in the minutes where they discuss moving things around. These cannon are going to go to Stowe. These ones will go back to Concord. So many canteens. There were 15,000 canteens stored out from Potter's house, and how many of them were going to be moved around so if the British came, they couldn't get them all. I don't think they had enough time once they made their decisions here to carry it all out. Obviously, some were moved, but some of the supplies were still here when the British came in.
Now, they were looking to raise an army of observation. I mean, what is this? How large is it?
Well, army of observation, they were talking about having roughly 15,000 men, and it's funny that they have this army of observation to watch what's going on at the same time that they're building all these supplies up to inevitably go to war.
I mean, that's treason. I mean, plain and simple.
Oh, yeah.
And drafting the rules and regulations for the Massachusetts Army.
Rules and regulations were drafted right next door. That's a huge thing. Yeah. They were drafted April 5th is when they sat down and put it all together. It took a little while, and they were printed on May 3rd, 1775, for issue to the Army.
Yeah, drafted really 2 weeks before they went to war.
Before they went to war.
Yeah, so they're really getting ready. They know it's coming.
It's happening,
which is just an incredible effort. And, and one of the things that struck me, like one of the iconic images we have of April 19th is Paul Revere riding through the night. The signal lanterns, one if by land, two if by sea. But if you look in the minutes of the Committee of Safety, they're talking about setting that up. About having riders that are going to go out to the principal magazines, including Concord, and alerting Colonel Barrett, who's supposed to keep teams of men and oxen in readiness to move these supplies if they get word from committee members in Charlestown.
You have to think about, too, is when they got the word, there's a note that goes to John Hancock from Elbridge Gerry, a member of the committee, and it's saying that the British officers are on a patrol and they know, we ought to be serious, is what it says. And Hancock responds back, I'll send word to Concord. And so that's at 9 o'clock at night on the 18th. And Barrett and Haywood and many of the others that ran the teams had a Herculean effort to try and get as many supplies out of town as they could before the British arrived that morning. You think about those men were up all night long moving supplies, hoping to make sure that as little as possible was destroyed by the British.
And of course, as we know, when the British did arrive on this search and destroy mission, they found some things and destroyed some things, but a lot of it they didn't. And, if you look at Gage's list that he had from the spies in Concord that were sending information out, not all of the locations of her supplies are listed. Ebenezer Hubbard on the other side of the mill pond from this structure had flour, which they had found. They got some cannon shot and musket balls from the courthouse. They burned some cannon carriages that had been built for the use of the field artillery. But they really didn't get a whole lot, and a lot of that is because of how well the committee worked.
Hi, my name is Joel Bohy, and I'm a researcher of the events of April 19th, 1775. Today we're at the Buckman Tavern in Lexington, Massachusetts. Can you imagine a time when you're nervous, you're sitting waiting, whether it's an appointment or something you're nervous about, just the feelings that you feel in your heart, your head. Think about the way the Lexington militia might have felt that night of April 18th into April 19th as they sat in Buckman Tavern waiting for the British column to arrive. So to tell us a little more about Buckman Tavern and its history, we have Sarah McDonough from the Lexington Historical Society. Sarah, can you give us a little history of Buckman Tavern itself and the events that early morning of April 19th, 1775?
Sure. Well, this was already a well-established tavern in 1775. It had opened in 1713 as a tavern, so we were already several generations in of Lexingtonians who would have frequented this building. And it was a bit of a community center. We're right here in the dead center of Lexington, right across the street from the Green. And so it was the perfect place for people to meet. This is where the militia went on the early morning of April 19th. Once Paul Revere had brought the word to Lexington that something might be happening that night, all of the militia were called out to the Green, but after several hours of having no word of what was to happen, several of the men who lived far enough away that they might not be able to make it back in time in case something did go wrong, decided to come in here while the rest of the men were sent home, just in case it was a false alarm. But as we all know, it wasn't a false alarm.
Not only do we have this wonderful structure as a witness to the events that morning, April 19th, 1775, but we have an object, a tall case clock built by Nathaniel Mulligan that was in this room that morning in the collection of the Concord Museum.
So we're at the Concord Museum, looking at their new April 19th exhibit, and we're with curator David Wood. So what can you tell us about this artifact?
Well, I can tell you it's an 8-day clock made in Lexington in 1769. It's got a composite brass dial, which is typical of the period. It's got cast brass parts and a brass sheet, a silvered chapter ring. The chapter ring carries the numerals, and it's silvered, so there's contrast with the black, and you can read the time readily. And there's an engraving above it also on a piece of silvered metal of an engraving of a phoenix rising from the ashes with the motto, Tempus Fugit. And it's housed now in a monumental cherry case with a sarcophagus top and gilt balls at the top. The case is actually a reproduction made for us by Bill Hewitt. We had the dial and the movement, but it never had it lost its case sometime in the 19th century. But the reason we care about the movement and the dial is also engraved right there for all to see. This is John Buckman's clock, and the date 1769 is on there. So John Buckman is the keeper of the tavern in the center of Lexington on the night of April 18th, morning of April 19th. When Revere brought his alarm, the militia mustered. Nothing happened. They dispersed. Some of them went to Buckman's Tavern to wait for the sound of the drum to summon them to the common, and some went to their homes if they were nearby. But you can imagine that some portion of Captain Parker's company was waiting out those, 3 o'clock in the morning, to the sound of this clock.
So we're at the Muster Field, part of Minuteman National Historical Park in Concord, Massachusetts. Behind me is the North Bridge. You can probably just see the monument on the other side. This is the field where about 450 provincial militia and Minutemen formed before they marched off to the fight at the bridge. There were 2 lines behind me that stretched over into the woods. How do we know where they were? Let's go to the Concord Museum and find out. So we're here at the Concord Museum, checking out their April 19th exhibit, and David Wood, curator, is going to tell us about these flints here.
Okay, so what we have are actually 22 gun flints, each about an inch square, and they are arranged in 2 lines, some of them slightly smaller than some of the others, some of them with some damage on them, some with no damage at all. And these were discovered in 1934 by an archaeologist who knew the Muster Field, which lies just above the bridge, and knew it had not been plowed in his memory. And this is Benjamin Lincoln Smith, founder of the Mass Archaeological Society. He knew that if a field in Concord gets plowed in the spring and it rains, you'll find native-made artifacts. And that was his interest, was the stone artifacts of the indigenous people of Concord. But what he found instead were about 100 gun flints in 2 lines, and he correctly deduced what they were. Because there is an account that the adjutant of the day, Joseph Hosmer, put the minute troops in one line and the militia troops in another line. There are about 450 provincials up there above the bridge at that point. And what's not recorded, that fact is recorded. What's not recorded is that they changed their flints. These flints themselves are the only evidence that that happened. And it's clear the order was change your flints, because some of these are used and some are unused. They were all changed. Some are larger for, they're meant for a firearm like a Brown Bess. Some are smaller because they're meant for a fowler, like the fowlers you can see in the case above them. The thing there are a couple things about this that I find especially fascinating. One is that when you think we did this, we walked up there, when you stand there and you think, okay, here they are in 2 lines, and there are the regulars down there at the bridge, the regulars could see that they were changing their flints. And you change your flints because you want a nice fresh flint in there, and you get a whole shower of sparks. and your musket is more likely to go off. So it's an audacious thing to do, right there in full view. But the other thing is, we know who these guys were, many of them. Not all of them, we know who some of them were. And I look at these and I go, I know that one of those people pinched that between thumb and forefinger and dropped it at his feet. And then about a minute later, marched down to the bridge in military order, and when ordered to do so, returned fire. Just an extraordinary moment.
So we have another artifact that was very close to the fight that day, and Erica Loam from the Concord Museum is going to tell us about it.
This is a looking glass. It is made of walnut and pine, and used to have more mirrored glass in it. Now all that is left is a small fragment in the lower left-hand corner of the frame. So it is empty right now, but the walnut frame still survives. And this belonged to Captain David Brown. He was a captain in Concord's Minute Company. And the morning of April 19th, this poor looking glass suffered a pretty brutal fate. David Brown's house was footsteps away from the North Bridge, and on the morning of April 19th, light infantry from the 10th Regiment were posted outside that house. David Brown himself was at the North Bridge mustering with the rest of Concord's militia and minute companies, and members of the light infantry just went right into his house and vandalized it. They smashed the butt of their musket into this looking glass, and the glass shattered and left all but this one fragment on the floor, and kind of the rest of it's been lost to time, I would imagine. But the family kept this looking glass with that fragment of glass in it. And a little bit of background for you, looking glasses were among the more expensive items in a household in the 18th century. And that's because the glass inside them, the specialized process of making that glass, made it very expensive to obtain. You essentially had to get it from England. And so the glass is the expensive feature, not necessarily the wood around it. And to have a looking glass in your home was a marker of great, good, let's say great wealth and status, especially one of this size. And so the act of smashing it was really a brutal act of vandalism. And this wasn't just a one-off. We know that British regulars did this throughout the Revolution, and it was a purposeful act of violence. And can you imagine coming back to your home and seeing this beautiful mirror now broken? And it served as a reminder that the violence on April 19th was not just towards other people, but it was towards these objects, which have now since acted as witnesses to the events of April 19th. And when you think about how it survived years and years, centuries, the members of David Brown's family knew that this was an important artifact, and they knew it was worth preserving. And so we're incredibly lucky that it's here today at the Concord Museum.
So we're here at Minuteman National Historical Park, and we're at the site of Captain David Brown's house. You can see it right behind me here, are these granite markers. The North Bridge is directly behind us. And who was Captain David Brown? Park Ranger Jim Hollister is going to tell us about him.
So David Brown was 47 years old. He was a farmer. He had a modest farm in Concord, about 67 acres. He lived here with his wife Abigail and 10 children, plus their uncle Elias. So smallish house, large family, a little bit cramped, but he was well respected in town, active in town government. He was also responsible for maintaining the road and the causeway leading to the North Bridge right behind me. Now, in January of 1775, when the town of Concord voted to raise a Minuteman company, David Brown, active in militia affairs, was elected as lieutenant of the company under the command of Captain John Buttrick. And later, when John Buttrick was promoted to major, David Brown became moved into the captaincy and command of the company. Now, if you think about what's going on in 1775, you have a military government in Boston. The harbor is blockaded by the Navy. There's a growing presence of British regulars in the town, and it's looking increasingly hostile. However, they've been watching this situation deteriorate really over a span of about 10 years. But on April 19th of 1775, particularly for the Brown family, that whole crisis that had been involving governments on either side of the Atlantic Ocean literally came here to his own front yard.
So we're at the Ebenezer Fiske house site, and we're going to talk with Jared Foose, Park Ranger at Minuteman National Park, for a little bit about it.
Yeah, so this is the backside of Fiske Hill. It's the easternmost section of Minuteman National Historical Park, and this is the location of some heavy fighting on April 19th, 1775 during the British retreat back towards Boston later in the afternoon. And the really fascinating thing about this site in particular is that we have multiple stories and artifacts and things that came from the individuals that fought across this landscape. And the area behind us here was the Ebenezer Fiske house itself. It's no longer there, unfortunately. The foundation still remains today. But the Fiske family lived here during the time of the battle, and Ebenezer Fiske himself was bedridden. So first thing in the morning, when the British troops started marching towards Concord, the Fiske family decided they were going to stay in the Ebenezer Fiske house because they were afraid of moving the elder Ebenezer. However, as the fighting started getting closer on April 19th, the family decided it was time to go. And Ebenezer and his son, Benjamin Fiske, and his daughter-in-law, Rebecca Fiske, actually decided to load Ebenezer into an ox cart, and they flee to another house further away from the road itself and further away, hopefully, from the fighting. Unfortunately, even though they fled away from the road, they were still in the midst of the whirlwind that came off of Fiske Hill later that afternoon. British soldiers come rushing down the backside of Fiske Hill, followed closely by colonial militia, attacking them and flank and rear the entire way. And the incredible thing is that Rebecca Fiske actually leaves an account about this entire experience. She was 27 years old at the time of the battle when she fled, and she was watching from a distance the fighting that swept over Fiske Hill, and she talked about those British soldiers retreating and fighting a rearguard action all the way away. And then she also talked about, after the guns had fallen silent, coming back to her home and the incredible devastation that she found in and around the area. She said that her garden had been completely trampled, all the flowers destroyed. But then, when she walked inside her front parlor, what did she find but horribly wounded soldiers left behind after the fighting? A number of British soldiers, she recalled, lying in puddles of their own blood, wallowing in misery after being horribly wounded here. But she also found another young man, a young militia soldier who had been grievously wounded here outside of the Fiske house. So yeah, that soldier, that young militia soldier that Rebecca Fiske came back home to find horribly wounded in her front parlor was none other than a young man named James Hayward of Acton. And as the years went past, the story of what happened to James Hayward started to become kind of a legend in the area of Lexington and Concord and this region. And as you can see, there's a monument here along the original Battle Road Trail. This monument was put up in the late 19th century to mark the spot where Hayward was mortally wounded. As the story goes, he was supposedly getting a drink from this well when he turned around to see a British soldier exiting out of the Fiske house. Both men, only a rod or about 16 feet apart, leveled their guns and fired at each other. The British soldier was killed instantly. Rebecca Fiske actually talked about coming home and finding that British soldier lying dead on her doorstep, his blood still trickling down over the stone. James Hayward was also shot. He was mortally wounded and then taken into the house where he died later that evening.
So he was shot through his powder horn, and the powder horn survives. It's in the collection of the Acton Memorial Library, donated by the family years ago. And it has a bullet hole entrance and a bullet hole exit. And it sent the ball with shards of powder horn into his side. So we know that he was shot through the horn survives. Now we're going to move off to Lexington.
So we're at Monroe Tavern, owned by the Lexington Historical Society, and today Chris Kaufman's going to tell us something about this great document that's on the table.
So we have Dr. Fiske's bill here. He was a doctor in Lexington. And on it, he notes several British troops that he treated in the days following the battle on April 19, 1775. We know that he travels to Woburn to treat some troops. We know he treats at least 7 British troops at Buckman Tavern, but we also know he goes to the Fiske home and treats 3 wounded British soldiers in their home as well.
So we're at Monroe Tavern with Stacy Frazier, curator of collections here. Tell us about this.
Well, this is an object that is kind of hard to tell what it is upside down, which is how we have it. But if you can imagine this, flip the other way with this square part at the top and the pump handle and a faucet here. This was the pump that was on the site of the well on the Fiske property where the fight that we've been talking about happened. It was something that had been in our collection for a long time. We kind of identified it about 10 years ago with Joel's help as this particular pump. We've matched it up to the photographs of the pump when it was on location. And when we think about it in context with the powder horn and the other items, that idea of kind of everything, these objects were in the same space at the same time while this moment was happening. And it's pretty amazing to look, the fact that the pump's still here, it's an old wooden well pump. It's not something that necessarily you'd save in the same way you'd save, your grandfather's powder horn. So the fact that we have it, the fact that the park, interprets the site, it's a wonderful connection.
So we're at the Concord Museum with Erica Lohm. We're going to talk about this door. Can you fill us in on the history?
Sure. Well, on the morning of April 19th, when the 700 regulars came to Concord, they split up into different companies. About 100 regulars went to the North Bridge, about 100 more went to the South Bridge. Most of them stayed in the center of town, but another 100 went to Colonel James Barrett's house. And that's where they were led to believe that's where the stockpile of militia, military supplies was being held. And in fact, it was. Colonel James Barrett was a senior officer in the Concord militia, and he was sort of in charge of coordinating the stockpile of military supplies, and a lot of it was at his house. But before the regulars came to town, they had strategically moved most of it off-site, so there's really nothing for them to find. But that morning they didn't know that, and so about 100 red-coated British regulars arrive at James Barrett's house, and they knock on this door. And behind the door is James' wife, Rebecca Barrett. Now, by that point, James had left the house to go muster above the North Bridge, so it was Rebecca home alone with her children. And if you can picture for a minute just how intimidating that would be, knowing that behind the door are 100 men who are looking to search your house. You don't know what to expect or to anticipate. And Rebecca did let them in, and they didn't find anything. So they left, thankfully, peacefully and returned to town. But it kind of just goes to show that everyone in Concord kind of knew what the stakes were. They were, rolling cartridges in their home. They were stockpiling supplies. The wives were just as aware as their husbands about what was going on. And Rebecca Barrett was an avid supporter of the provincial cause. So, she knew what the stakes were. And, they weren't just willing to risk their life. They were willing to risk their property, their home, and the things in it. So, that's really what the stakes are the morning of April 19th, not just for the men at the North Bridge, but for the women who remained in town and had to fend for themselves. And pretty remarkable story when you think about it.
It is. It really is. Hi, I'm Joel Bohy, and today we're at the Arlington Historical Society, and we have the director, Sarah Lundberg, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Hannah Adams and her story on April 19th, 1775.
Yeah, so here we have objects from the Hannah Hall and Joseph Adams' house. Joseph Adams was the deacon of the local congregation, and he hid the communion silver in this blanket chest, in the bottom drawer of this blanket chest, and left his wife in bed with her infant daughter that she had had just a few days earlier. She was, the medical care wasn't the way it is today, so when a woman would have a baby, she would usually have to lie in bed for many weeks, and that was the case with Hannah Adams. And so as the troops came through, and they were ransacking the house, they came up to Hannah Adams, nearly killed her, but decided to spare her life and her infant daughter's life. And then she left the house, and they stole the communion silver, which we have here on display, and they used the pages of Hannah's Bible to start a fire in the house, which her children later put out with homebrewed beer.
Hello viewers, my name is Jim Hollister, Park Ranger at Minuteman National Historical Park, and you are about to watch an amazing video featuring a number of April 19th witness houses that still, nearly 250 years later, bear the physical scars of the battle in the form of bullet strikes. Now, what I find so interesting and powerful about these bullet strikes is that they're within homes, domestic spaces where we're supposed to feel safe. And this really, I think, is powerful testimony to the sense of intrusion and shocking violence resulting from the events of April 19, 1775. Now, towards the end of the video, please stay with us. We're going to feature an interview with archaeologist Dr. Doug Scott and historians Joel Bohy and Chris Fox about their ongoing research to document and analyze all known April 19th bullet strikes and a few unknown. So, enjoy the video.
So we're here at the Elisha Jones house, part of Minuteman National Park. This is a private residence, and we have a shed that is attached to the house currently, but in the 18th century, it was probably a little bit further down. It was moved at some point and attached to the house. But there's an account of a bullet striking it from British light infantry who were retreating from North Bridge. And we've got the strike right here. You can see this diamond with the white clapboards or white sheathing behind it, white painted sheathing. The strike measures just about .70, so just over a .69 caliber ball from a British musket. And people have questioned it for a long time. But there's some telltale signs on the inside of the building that we'll look at in a minute. So we're inside the Elisha Jones house shed right now, and you can see we saw the outside of the bullet hole. Now you can see the inside where it blew through the wall and hit this oak post and shot across to the back of the room. But you can see the typical blowout that happens when something's hit by a bullet, where the chunks of wood fly off. So as you get to Lexington, one of the first bullet strikes is from the front door of the Buckman Tavern, and you can see it right here. The ball went through at an angle and probably rattled off the wall or went through the wall on the inside. And we actually used a ballistics rod to figure out where the shot came from, and it's in a low area right out front. You can basically get a good idea of where the shooter was standing. It's a .69 caliber ball that went through. It gauges at about .70, so we know it was a British musket ball, and it was more than likely fired during the retreat, right before Percy's forces arrived. Here we have the exit of that musket ball that went through the front of the Buckman Tavern door. You can see where it came through at an angle, right here, and the typical blowout. It blew the back of the board off. But it's typical of most all the musket balls that we study. So we're in the Monroe Tavern, owned by the Lexington Historical Society. In the tavern, we have a bullet strike in the ceiling. Probably came through the window from Mass Ave right out here. And it hit the ceiling of the tap room right here. And this was so important to the family that over the generations they kept it. They redid the ceiling around it, but still kept that hole so that everybody could see it and remember what happened that day. So we're here at the Jason Russell House in Arlington, Massachusetts. At the time of the battle, this would have been the village of Menotomy, a part of Cambridge. And we're with Director of the Historical Society, Sarah Lundberg. Sarah, you want to tell us a little bit about Jason Russell and the events of April 19th?
Yeah, so the house was built in the 1740s by Jason Russell, who worked as a farmer like most people in Menotomy. He had about 100 acres of farmland that stretched all the way up what is now called Jason Street in his honor. By 1775, he was an older man in his late 50s. Most of his family had moved on, and he lived in the house with his 2 youngest children and his wife. And as the battle was going on, his family was sent to safety up the street in what is today Belmont. But Jason decided to make a stand and to protect his house and his property. And he used the stone wall along the side of what is today Mass Avenue, and he used some shingles that he had for working on his house to kind of reinforce the gate, and was firing on the troops. But what he didn't realize was that some flankers would be coming around the back of the house, and they essentially caught him from the rear, and he tried to retreat into the house, as did many other people, and he unfortunately didn't make it and was killed somewhere around his front door.
So along with Jason Russell, there were 11 other men killed from a variety of towns, Danvers, Needham, and there was battle damage to this house. So we're going to go inside with Chris Fox, colleague on this ballistic strike study, and we're going to go take a look at some of those bullet strikes. Let's go inside.
As Sarah and Joel were describing, the Jason Russell House is the site of some very intense fighting in the afternoon of April 19th, 1775, as the British forces were retreating back to Boston. And what this house preserves are a number of bullet strikes where British soldiers were firing into the house during that afternoon. And what we have noticed is that they were specifically firing at windows. And in the case of this bullet strike right here, it's across the room just from a window facing current-day Massachusetts Avenue. It's a bullet size, it's a British ball-sized hole. And what's interesting is when we used a bore scope to look into the hole, we can see that when the bullet passed through the paneling here, striking some wood inside, it actually sort of changed shape a bit, as you might expect with a soft lead ball. And then it passed through the plaster on the back side of the wall. And we'll walk out into the hallway here, and we'll be able to take a look at what happened to that ball after it went through the wall. So after the ball passed through that panel in the parlor and came through the plaster on this side, amazingly enough, it impacted the corner of this newel post, leaving this deep gash in the corner of it, at which point it glanced off of that, passing maybe through the door behind me or hitting some other portion of the wall, but we don't see any evidence of sort of where it went after it struck that post. This is the kitchen of the Jason Russell House, where some very intense fighting took place also in the afternoon of April 19th. As the British were retreating back to Boston, they quickly surrounded this house, and some men from Beverly, Massachusetts were in here, and as the British were surrounding it, they couldn't get out, so they had to hide themselves somewhere. And what they did is a group of men went down into the cellar through the door behind me. When the British came in, they knew that the soldiers were in here, and somehow they must have been alerted to the fact that they were in the cellar. And the British seemingly began firing through this door. This is a reproduction. And when they did that, it left some very amazing evidence of that day's fight in the form of these 2 bullet holes in the risers of the stairs going to the second floor just inside. You can see them highlighted there with a 19th century sign on the one riser, and then through the cutout on the one behind it, or just below it. Now, as we were doing this study last fall, documenting these holes, we actually discovered another hole that had apparently never been noticed before. And it's located just inside the doorway here, where apparently a ball went through the original surround on this door, passed through like the wall sheathing here before ending up maybe as one of these shots that we see in the risers. So on the outside of these risers, we can see where the balls exited from where they were fired through the stairs from the kitchen area. And what's interesting to note is the fact that the backside here has this area where you can see the wood has clearly been splintered out when the ball passed through it. Clear evidence that the balls came from the other side or the kitchen.
So today I'm joined by 3 very special guests, historians Joel Bohy and Chris Fox, and archaeologist Dr. Doug Scott, who have been studying and documenting these bullet strikes for quite some time. So gentlemen, just a very basic question. What can we learn from studying these bullet strikes?
Well, I think, I think all of us will agree with this, that
we went into this thinking about it in a bunch of different ways. The violence of the day, reading the primary accounts of what the British were doing on the retreat, which was shooting at windows, trying to shoot at any position that a provincial could fire back. But then as, Chris and I, and then Chris and Doug and I went through the house, we started to look at the caliber of the ball. We could tell what type of gun they came from and where they came from. And I think that was one of the most fascinating things for me, was when, Doug would put the ballistics rods in and Chris was holding the laser and you could see where the shooter was standing.
And I agree that finding where the shooters were standing, and what we're using is a very simple process. We're adapting forensic firearms shooting incident reconstruction techniques to essentially very large artifacts, the Jason Russell house in this particular case, and the bullet holes are defects in that artifact. And with that information, by using presumptive lead tests and trajectory rods and the lasers, we can reconstruct where these soldiers were standing and where they and when and how they fired into the house, and the residual effect of that, of leaving holes in those walls.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. And I think the other thing that perhaps we have gained a stronger understanding about is the fact that these bullet holes were preserved. They were saved. They're still here to be seen, which I think speaks volumes about the importance of what was happening to those folks on April 19th, 1775. And they knew that this was a momentous occasion in certainly not only just their lives, but the lives of the country that they were just about to form, I believe. And knowing that, a lot of folks made sure that those sites remained visible so that people, I think, didn't forget.
Oh, that's fascinating. And was there anything that surprised you in the course of this study?
Well, in my case, with the looking at the bullet holes, and I agree with Chris, this is a memorialization process of a momentous signal event in American history, and people realize they need to preserve these things, or at least some of them. But it becomes very personal when you think about that a gun held by a British regular fired into that house, and may or may not have struck anyone. These are very personal artifacts, very poignant artifacts or defects in those walls that people decided to preserve and pass down through the generations. That's a remarkable thing.
Yeah, it is. And we were talking about the Jason Russell house, but we managed to hit every bullet strike, so to speak, that's left. And, some of them we found through newspaper searches where they were memorialized and discussed in the 1800s. And, some of the structures that were discussed are gone, and some of the objects they've talked about are gone. But there's still quite a few reminders left that were saved. And it was, as Chris and I have gone down the list, we've looked at every one of them, and it's just amazing that these things do survive.
I think it's also remarkable that, and Doug has certainly described this already, that we were able to trace trajectories, and in one case see where a bullet had passed through the siding and sheathing of the Jason Russell house, then passed through an interior partition, and then deflected off of a ceiling. To have the three sites of impact from one shot is pretty remarkable. And one of the amazing things that was realized as we were sort of realizing this ourselves is that nobody had put it together in the past, seemingly. We had made a new discovery. And there were other discoveries like that were made in the Jason Russell house that just, when it all comes together, it just serves to better illustrate the ferocity and the drama that was unfolding that day.
So by using these modern techniques, you're really able to sort of place soldiers, in proximity to the house, in a way, kind of reconstruct what was happening inside and outside of the house. It sounds like, like a sort of like a modern crime scene investigation.
That's exactly what it is. It's using those forensic shooting incident reconstruction techniques and theory and applying it to a historic event in this particular case. So it's an archaeological application, not true forensics, since that's science applied to the law. So we don't have a legal issue here. But it is still remarkable to be in those in that house, the Jason Russell House, or see the panels that are in museum collections or siding that have been saved, and see those holes that were clearly caused by bullets. And in some cases, we're even using a presumptive lead test to able to come up with a confirmation that a ball passed through that particular piece of wood. And it adds poignancy to it, to see that these things were preserved and that we can learn something about the past from them that we maybe didn't know. In the case of Jason Russell House, it's the location of the shooters. Where were they in the surrounding area, in the yard, on the road, wherever they might have been?
Absolutely. The other thing that struck me was that, these balls are passing through multiple layers of wood. These aren't slingshots. I mean, these are relatively powerful weapons. Can you tell us anything about the range that they're fired from, how that might impact their hitting power?
Well, the one Chris mentioned is probably, for me anyway, one of the coolest ones in the Jason Russell House. You could see right where the shooter was standing, right down below, from the kitchen parlor, the upstairs room. And you could see where the ball had struck at an angle and blew the wood of the paneling out before it went up and hit the wall and then skipped off the ceiling, as Chris has said. The power of that musket ball. The shooter was close. He was very close.
And I think that's an important point here, is that the shooters were close to that house, standing just on the yard just below, shooting at or through that window, or standing on the road in front of the house, about where present-day Massachusetts Avenue is. It's pretty close range. So as those muskets were fired, being that they're close range, the shot still has a lot of energy in it as it strikes that building.
In a way, this also ties into the ballistic study that we have been working on for 4 or 5 years now, where we actually fired the guns and collected the data, and now we're actually seeing the damage that that information gives us.
Yes, and the ballistic study was just live fire into tissue simulant as well as backstops and so forth, which will record the velocity of the bullets as they pass through things and also exit the barrel. Provide us a tremendous amount of information, and seeing these bullet holes is confirmation that those live fire studies are showing that the velocity of these bullets, let's use the British Brown Bess as the example, since that's what we seem to be dealing with in the house, is that they were going at anywhere from 900 to 1,200 feet per second and going through the soft wood and still having enough energy to pass through not only the siding and the sheeting, but interior wall paneling as well, before they lost their kinetic energy. So if those balls didn't hit anything, and we know that others did because there were a number of provincials killed in that house or around it, that these 1 ounce balls that were being fired, or nearly 1 ounce, are extremely deadly.
Really kind of brings home just really what was happening that day. And it's such a dangerous, incredibly dangerous environment. When you have soldiers and civilians caught up in it, just absolutely terrifying. So any final thoughts about this study?
We need to finish it.
We're actually working on that right now, Jim. We're in the process. Doug's doing a part, and Chris and I are working on another part, and we're going to try and get it all together, and it's going to be published into book form. So.
Well, we will certainly look forward to that. So thank you, gentlemen. Again, Joel Bohy, Chris Fox, and Doug Scott. And so happy Patriots Day, everyone.